We're going to start. Welcome to today's webinar on building market linkages in Uganda. I'm pleased to see so many familiar and unfamiliar names popping up in the participant list. I'm Richard Caldwell. I'm a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'll be your moderator today. As we get started, maybe a couple of housekeeping items. Bear in mind we're recording this webinar, and this recording then will be made available publicly over the next few weeks. After this brief introduction, we'll have about 50 minutes for the presentation, and afterwards we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A session beginning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, basically 1 hour from now. So this is important. Please type your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. And you can find this feature in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And due to the number of people on the call, we will not be turning on mics. Therefore, your questions will have to be posted in the Q&A feature. Our speaker has graciously volunteered to be interrupted if we have any type of clarification questions. Make sure they're noted as such, and I can interrupt Craig to get his response. Okay, our speaker today is Dr. Craig McIntosh, a development economist who specializes in evaluating large-scale anti-poverty programs in Africa and Latin America. Craig is a professor at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy, and he's also co-director of the SIGA J-PAL Agriculture Initiative. This is also referred to as a TIE, or the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative. In addition, he's co-director of UC San Diego's Policy Design and Evaluation Lab. Craig is currently working on research projects testing how technology can be used to extend financial services and deepen agricultural markets, as well as a set of studies seeking to understand how the impact of cash transfers relates to a more conventional types of development assistance. Today, Greg joins us from Oxford, England, where he's currently a visiting professor. A few things about this particular study before I turn it over to Craig. It was conducted by Craig and as a co-investigator, Professor Lauren Falcao-Bergquist, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. The study had two main collaborators. The first one was AgriNet Uganda. This is a major food market intermediary in Uganda. And then the second was Kudu. Kudu is a digital trading platform developed by the AI and data science research group at Makerere University, which is also in Uganda. And this Kudu, this digital platform, matches farmers and buyers based on price and distance, and it also aggregates or bulks bids to encourage successful trading. For this study, the platform itself was rolled out and randomized over 110 sub-counties in Uganda, which is like 14% of the surface area of the country. So it's not your typical RCT size-wise. And the researchers partnered with the Innovations for Poverty Action Uganda, or IPA Uganda, for the data collection. So before we start, a few spoiler alerts that I found interesting, and I'm sure Craig will dive deeper into. But first is the platform actually generated significant increases in revenue among farmers most likely to use the platform. And those using the platform turned out to be predominantly your larger scale producers. Second, from an overall welfare perspective, the platform was strongly cost beneficial given its low cost per farmer. And third, the digital platforms, these digital trading platforms such as Kudu may represent something of a highly scalable opportunity to connect farmers with buyers and improve market integration for farmers. There's a lot going on in terms of platforms. Kudu is not the only platform like this. There's a lot of really interesting research ongoing and future research, I think, that will elicit a lot more information about how these markets function. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Professor McIntosh.
Okay, Richard, thanks so much for that generous introduction. And let me go ahead and set up and share my screen here. Okay, so there is the slide deck. Everyone see that all right? So before I get started, let me just express some thanks. So first of all, thanks to the Gates Foundation and to FCDO who have supported Atai and supported this project. We also got support from IGC and from 2 different parts of USAID, from the Development Impact Lab and from the Basis CRISP as well. So lots of folks enabled us to do this project. As you'll see, it was a big and expensive project. And so I want to thank all of those supporters. And then also, of course, Lauren, who has been my partner in crime. I think we wrote the first grant for this project 8 years ago. So we've put years of our lives into making this work. And then over the course of the last few months, we've started collaborating with Meredith Starts as well, trying to build up a more structural version of kind of how we can analyze this experiment, how we can think about some of the GE effects, and I'll talk more about kind of what our ambitions are in terms of where we want to go with that. So let me just kind of motivate the big picture here by saying that, you know, probably the markets around the core food grains in Africa are, you know, arguably the markets with the greatest welfare implications on earth, in the sense that not only do you have a large majority of the poor operating as producers in these markets, and so they're highly dependent on agriculture for their source of income, but then you also have these markets with the same commodities serving as the core nutritional food markets for people on the consumption side. And even in a country like Uganda that has extremely fertile soil and is a breadbasket country that is exporting out to its neighbors, you still have, depending on the season, somewhere between 20 and 40% of Ugandan households are net buyers on the market, let alone ever buyers. And so, you know, within the agricultural cycle, households will switch back and forth between being producers and consumers. Markets will basically switch back and forth between being net producers and net importers. And all of this is to say that inefficiencies in these markets can potentially just have enormous welfare costs because of the important role that they play. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of liberalization of food markets in sub-Saharan Africa, but we still see large variation in prices, both across space, as would be predicted by having poor infrastructure and high transport costs, and across time, as would be predicted by having missing markets for storage and credit that mean that we get these large cyclical fluctuations across seasons, right? So lots of progress and lots of work remaining to be done in terms of generating well-integrated markets. Now, over the course of the last few years, there's been a lot of attention paid in the economics literature in particular to the role that non-transport barriers are going to play as obstacles to efficient trade. And the most prominent of these are search costs. So we have, you know, a number of kind of seminal papers illustrating the way in which the introduction of mobile phones has kind of revolutionized these markets. But then still some evidence that there's a ways to go and that mobile phones have not really solved this problem. So I think, you know, to us, the most compelling policy argument here is to say, well, look, we know if you want to have really perfectly integrated markets, you need to invest billions of dollars in heavy infrastructure to make that possible. So what makes the search cost argument so compelling is the possibility that maybe there's like $1 million investment that can be made rather than those billions in deploying ICT infrastructure, and that much smaller investment can get you some reasonable part of the way towards integrated markets. So, you know, the Gates Foundation is making new investments in this area, trying to see what can be done with these kinds of digital systems in agriculture. And so in some sense, then the way that we want to frame this paper is saying kind of how far towards an integrated market does that $1 million investment get you, rather than this really enormous investment in heavy infrastructure and storage that it will take to generate fully integrated markets. So what our study does is it provides the first large-scale randomized controlled trial of an agricultural market matching platform. So what we're doing, as Richard introduced nicely, is working with this technology that was developed at Makerere, which is called Kudu. And so what Kudu does, and I'll show you some graphics later to let you kind of visualize how it works, but the idea is that A farmer can come onto the system, they register their location so the system knows where they are, and then they open up what's called a USSD interface, so that gives them a 90-second live interface that they can navigate through a decision tree, and then they can post and ask on the system, I have such and such quantity of such and such product, and here's my reserve price that I would like to get. Then buyers can go onto the system as well. It can operate either on smartphones or on feature phones. And then in the back end, there's now an algorithmic matching process that is going through every day and trying to create the matches based on location, crops, and prices that maximize the sum of consumer and producer surplus from this market, and then basically connect up supply and demand and tries to facilitate trade. So in that sense, it's quite a pure intervention in search, right? So it's not about credit, it's not about grading, it's not about a bundle of other things. It really is just about improving the search process in these markets. So what we did to study this product, because we knew or hoped that we were going to be seeing effects on prices at the broader level. And so that means it's not really sensible to design a study that is putting, let's say, some farmers in the community into the treatment and some not, or maybe even just a village into the treatment. So what we did was step back and try to run an experiment at a very large pixel size. So we used the sub-county, which is the administrative layer below district in Uganda. So there's about 50,000 people on average in a sub-county. And so we assigned 55 sub-counties to be in the intervention, 55 to be in the control. And then we ran the whole study intervention for 3 full years, which is 6 harvest seasons, as a way of trying to really see what happens when the markets fully adjust to this new source of information and trading possibilities. So then, in order to capture what was happening, we had 3 completely different types of data collection that we engaged in. So the first of those was at the market level. So we set up a system where we trained traders who were operating in markets all over the country, all over the study area. And we called them every 2 weeks, and we did phone surveys of them about the prices, the quantities, the qualities, the flow of traders, et cetera, across 4 different crops. Almost everything I'll talk about today is going to focus on maize, which turned out to be by far the dominant crop, both on Kudu and in terms of the volumes for our traders. So that allows us to think about what's happening to the markets that are involved in the study. Now, a different question is what's happening to the traders who work in those markets. So we then also did a baseline, a midline, and an endline survey on a large sample of traders, which represents the majority of traders who live physically in the markets and operate based out of the markets that are engaged in the study. So that allows us to think about not just what's happening at a specific market location and time, but how are the traders altering the spatial pattern of where they buy and sell. So really to think about the flow of trade in a way that you wouldn't be able to capture just looking at one place. And then finally, because ultimately kind of the core welfare proposition of a platform like this is going to be based on farmers. So then we did a baseline and an endline survey of farmers. And we drew in kind of 2 different strata of farmers. So one of those were farmers who are located in the parish that the trading center is in. So these are going to be farmers that are very heavily exposed to changes in those markets. And then we randomly sampled another parish from that region. So these are like the far parishes. These are more rural people. These are people who are less directly exposed to markets. And so then that lets us think about kind of how the heterogeneity of the impacts that we might see as a function of how directly exposed a farming household is to the treatment. So we have those 3 layers that we'll be able to operate throughout the study in terms of thinking about impacts. So I want to take some time to kind of talk through what we find, and I'll do this in a fair amount of detail and then maybe kind of go through the tables quite quickly. So the core result really is that this platform does increase market integration, and it does so by increasing trade. So there is a substantially higher probability, a higher volume of trade that takes place between treated markets, more traders that are going back and forth between treated markets. Those effects are very pronounced at short distances and become much less pronounced at long distances when there's less trading taking place at all. And then we do indeed see a reduction in price dispersion between treated markets. So thinking about the data structure as dyads, pairs of markets, there's a substantial decrease in price dispersion between treated markets. And that price dispersion takes place over much longer distances than the actual trade that we see by any given trader. So what this is telling us is this intervention does work to reduce search costs. And therefore, kind of by extension, it has to be the case that even in an environment where mobile phones are completely ubiquitous for traders, right? I mean, these traders are walking around with kind of multiple phones on their belt at any moment in time. Even in that environment, we're still seeing that these kinds of platforms can reduce search costs and can lead consequently to improvements in market integration. Now, what we see that is maybe not quite what we expected when we designed the study is a number of things. So first of all, the treatment effects of this intervention are really about convergence, okay? So prices rise in areas that are relative surplus areas, and they fall slightly in areas that are relative deficit areas, okay? So the story is not one of overall providing much higher prices to farmers. The story is one of changing prices differentially so that we equilibrate prices across different kinds of regions. So that's a convergence effect. We find no change, a very small change in the average prices at the market level, substantively meaningful but statistically insignificant change in prices at the farm gate level. And so really at the end of the day, this is a story about prices coming together, not prices coming up. So a kind of a simple way of summarizing that convergence effect is that when we look in our control markets, we see price dispersion across markets that on average is about twice what it should be given transport costs, right? So the law of one price says that if you have perfect informational arbitrage, the price dispersion across two markets is never larger than the transport cost between those markets. We're seeing that on average, that gap is about twice the size of the transport cost. So in other words, lots of violations of the law of one price. And what the intervention does is to move that gap from 2 times to 1.8 times transport costs. So that's a way of saying this platform squeezes out about 20% of the search-based inefficiency that should not be in these markets in the first place. So not all of it, but a potentially meaningful share. So now how does this happen? What's the mechanism through which this happens? So I think if you read the way that practitioners tend to talk about these platforms, and indeed the way that we were talking about this platform at the time that we wrote our original grant proposals, there tends to be a really heavy emphasis on this idea of trader market power, right? So there's kind of preconception that, you know, the trader kind of has his foot on the neck of the smallholder farmer, and that their ability to kind of give these take it or leave it offers at the farm gate and then walk away if they don't get the deal they want leads to a circumstance that imperfect information is really a major obstacle in these markets. Traders have a lot of market power, and that if you're setting up interventions like this, the kind of logic for them is in some sense to try to kind of break that market power. And so the way that you tend to think about motivating these is to say, we want to create something where the smallholder farmer can sell direct to a big buyer. They can skip all these intermediaries and go right to those high-priced buyers by cutting out the middleman. So basically what we find is that mechanism is not at all the reason that this thing works. It does in fact squeeze trader profits, but not for a reason that looks like the individual traders have market power with respect to their negotiations with a specific farmer. So what we find, first of all, very simple stylized fact, is that almost all of the direct use of this platform is by traders, not by farmers. So farmers try to post on the platform a lot, but they're posting tiny quantities of grain. And big buyers do not want to buy those tiny quantities of grain. They want bulked, aggregated grain so they can send a large vehicle. They're willing to pay a high price for that. And they're simply not willing to send vehicles out into the rural areas to buy small amounts of grain. So the farmers are in general too small to take advantage either from the demand side, that as Treb Allen's work has said, for example, that it's not worth their while to engage in search because the costs of search are fixed and the benefits scale with the amount that you're selling. So not only may it not be worth smallholder farmers engaging in a lot of search, but even when they do, the commodity that they're selling is not the commodity that high-priced buyers want to buy because it's just too small. So virtually none of the flow of sales onto the platform comes from study farmers. It's almost all from study traders. And yet we see these increases in competition. There's increased entry. More traders operate between trader markets. Trader profits decrease. So, but why are they decreasing? It is not coming from a mechanism that says that a given trader and a given farmer negotiating, that this somehow tips the scales towards the farmers and allows them to get a better price in that negotiation. Really what it comes down to, right, is that traders make their money off of poor arbitrage, right? So my ability to make money as a trader comes from the fact that there are large price differences across markets. So I can make money by buying here and selling there. And so because this platform in general equilibrium leads to this reduction in price dispersion across markets, it basically shrinks the space over which spot market spatial traders can make money. And so they do higher volumes on lower margins and end up making less money as a result of the platform, not through an effect that looks like individual trader market power, but due to an effect that looks like reductions in overall price dispersion. And certainly nothing that looks like cutting out the middleman, right? So we just don't see any evidence of that. And so kind of the takeaway then is that, first of all, search-based market power in the hands of traders may not be as substantial as it's kind of generally thought to be. And secondly, it sort of emphasizes this point that traders are providing a service by moving grain into larger and larger quantities, and that this bulked maize being sold by a large trader is in many ways kind of a different thing than the very disaggregated lots that farmers are trying to sell themselves coming off of the field. So I think there's a number of ways in which these results kind of change how we think about what is the service that these intermediaries provide, and why is it that there are so many different intermediaries that grain tends to pass through? Is that a sign of market power, or is that a sign of some other type of inefficiency? So I'll come back and talk about that a little bit in the conclusion. And so then basically in terms of who benefits on the farmer side, there are small benefits overall from the platform. So this is basically a story of small benefits being realized by very large numbers of people, which I think is going to be typical of a lot of these digital platforms. They don't really revolutionize life for anyone, but they lead to benefits over such a large pool of people that in the end, they can end up being highly cost effective if you look at the total benefit generated relative to the total cost. Okay. So outline of the talk is as follows. I'll talk a little bit about literature, context, and design, and then basically go through the different layers of data that we have to try to tell the story of what the intervention did. So in terms of motivating the literature, let me just try to say that there are basically kind of these two quite different ways of thinking about the problem of search cost, right? So one of them is to say search costs are a problem because they lead to violation of the law of one price. There's bigger price dispersion across space than there should be. That has its own welfare costs because that dispersion is bad for producers, it's bad for consumers, and you can generate welfare by squeezing out that dispersion. But that's a very different motivation from this second set of papers listed here, who are trying to make the different point that if there's a lot of fog of war in these markets and it's very unclear to farmers what's going on, what are the profits that the traders get, what are the prices that the traders are selling at, if this trader walks away from me, how many other people will I have a chance to negotiate with? Those models are motivating this idea that imperfect information can actually be a source of market power. So it actually gives traders the ability to squeeze a better deal out of farmers because the trader knows more than the farmer does, and that becomes a source of bargaining advantage. So I just really want to emphasize that there are kind of these two different domains in which search costs could matter: violation of the law of one price and generation of market power. And in some sense, our results from the study are going to say that the first of these is very important and the second may not be as important as we thought. So most of the empirical literature that has looked at search costs has been based on the spread of mobile phones, work by Rob Jentz and Jenny Aker and many others. In recent years, there have been quite a few studies, because it's something that's relatively easy to do, that have done randomized trials on using phones to disseminate price information. So in other words, notifying farmers what prices they could get if they sold. In general, I want to say that the results of those studies has been uneven and a little bit disappointing. While there are a couple of them that have shown really substantial effects, in general, those information-only interventions don't seem to work that well. So that was kind of part of what motivated us in setting this study up, is like, maybe it's not enough to just know what the price is. You actually have to have an outside option that gives you kind of a viable alternative when you're negotiating to be able to get a better price. I think what we're going to see is that maybe a large part of what happened in this study is because we blasted out lots of information to both sides of the market, that there is something important both about scale, how many people are you telling about prices, and there's also something quite important about informing both sides of the market at once. So, the traders know that the farmers are informed, the farmers know that the traders know that the farmers are informed, and that may be important in and of itself. And then kind of the last thing that's really motivated in some of the more recent literature is the issue of commodities exchanges. This is not a commodities exchange in the sense that its goal is not to define this kind of single well-defined spot price, which is kind of the core purpose of a lot of the African commodity exchanges. Kenya, Ghana in particular, and Ethiopia have been working with these. So this is still very nascent in Africa. We don't really have well-functioning commodities exchanges, and I want to kind of tie back to that at the end as I think a very promising area for future work. So looking at the study area, so on the left, we're showing a map from the FuseNet system of USAID, which is representing in green the grain surplus areas of Uganda. And then on the right, we have our study districts, treatment and control. And so what you'll see is that in general, we're in surplus areas. So there are kind of two criteria that we use to try to select the study sample area. The first one is that they're big maize producers in the first place. If they weren't growing maize, this was not going to be an interesting question. And then the second one was that they are not totally remote. So we don't have any areas that are like right up on the Sudanese border, for example, but also not right on major highways. So we were trying to kind of find that sweet spot where they're not fully integrated by already having excellent road access and not so remote that what they need is a road rather than information to use roads that they already have. So that's the study area. And then to kind of motivate the basic space in which the study operates, what I'm representing here is just a smoothed line, which is the absolute price dispersion across markets within market dyads on the y-axis, and then the distance between dyads on the x-axis. And so what we're seeing here is that there is kind of this gradually increasing slope that as markets become further apart, they become less well integrated. But if we take the estimates from our study of what we think transport costs are based on our surveys with the traders, right, then what we see is that at long distances, the large majority of price dispersion does come from transport costs, but over much shorter distances, a very high share of the dispersion seems to be in violation of the law of one price, meaning that it is bigger than it would cost to move grain between those markets. And so that in that sense, you can kind of think of this study as operating in the gray area, right? So an intervention that was coming in and building roads would be trying to kind of shift the slope of that lower line down, because we're not influencing the costs of transportation, and we're just basically having the ambition to pull markets down to the law of one price. Then we're basically seeing how much of that gray area we can reduce. So a little bit of just kind of stylized facts on what's going on before we start. So these are baseline data on what traders and farmers were doing before the study began. So a very high share of traders report information as a barrier to expansion. But at the same time, traders are using phones very heavily in the way that they work. So about half of purchases and sales are done calling first to arrange things and make sure you understand the price before you go. About 43% of traders were receiving information by radio, and only 8% of both farmers and traders were receiving any kind of SMS prices. Okay, so the sort of this blasting out of prices by mobile phones is not something that was widespread, even for traders, who would be presumably the core market for that. And then we defined markets as being spokes, hubs, or super hubs. So a spoke is just a small rural market. A hub is like the district center through which a bunch of spokes trade. And then there are 4 super hubs in the study, which are Kampala, and then the 3 major border markets through which Uganda exports out to its neighbors. And so what we see is that basically, both traders and farmers are better informed about prices in local markets than they are about prices in super hubs, as you would expect. And in general, traders are better informed about prices than farmers are, also, as you would expect. One surprising fact is that only 8% of farmers are using the radio. 6% of farmers are using the radio to get price information, right? So that information is out there, it's on the radio, and farmers are not accessing it in a really widespread way as of baseline. Okay. So then in terms of talking about Kudu, so this is a little screenshot of what Kudu looks like on a feature phone. So this was built as a collaboration between computer scientists at Makerere and Microsoft Research. As I said, buyers and sellers can post quantity, desired price, and location. And then what the algorithm does is it essentially has a model of transport costs. And so by knowing what the location is between 2 individuals, the distances between 2 individuals, and the price gaps between 2 individuals, for every buyer, it is then trying to find the best sellers and match them up in order to be able to create the best trades that it can. So the way that Kudu naturally works is it just sends out information on the 3 best sellers to every buyer, and then that's the end of it. So there's no mechanism to really follow up and figure out what happened. So what we did as a part of the study was to add 2 things onto the top of Kudu. One of them is we actually followed those studies up, those matches up, and went and called the traders and called the farmers and said, okay, did you do any business? What's going on? We also built a manual system where we had individuals sitting in an office in Kampala who were looking at the back end data so they could see all the bids and all the asks on the platform at a moment in time. And they were then doing manual matching. Okay, so they were basically saying, all right, I know where you are. I can sort these lists by distance, and I'm going to try to match up people who I know are good buyers and good sellers. And then I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to work the phones and try to make these sales happen. So it's a more expensive, heavier touch way of trying to match up supply and demand. And in the end, in fact, the majority of the real business that got done on the platform got done as a result of those manual matches. So that turns out to be a very important part of the overall study in terms of what we see. Then another feature that we built in, which was not there in Kudu itself, is that we set up a system that we call the SMS blast. So we were sending out about 25,000 text messages a month. We were informing all of the study traders in treatment areas, and then a randomized 3/4 of the farming households in study areas of prices in their downstream markets. So we basically had defined the supply chains that people typically sell into, and we were sending them prices on all of those downstream markets. So we were hopefully kind of allowing them to infer what the profit margins were for people who were trading and what the prices are that they should have been asking. And so we had a number of different randomizations that let us look at the information only effect. So in other words, we can kind of unbundle what part of the total effect is coming just from those price information alerts versus from the overall platform. And the main flavor of the results is going to be that it's really the overall platform that matters, and kind of, in harmony with a lot of the rest of the literature, this price information only may not be a very effective way of doing things. So then to promote Kudu, we worked with Agranet, which is an agribusiness firm in Uganda. We trained 210 of their agents to be so-called commission agents, to go out and to try to broker trades now from the village up, so that they were out working with farmers to try to get business to work. In the end, a number of things that we tried to do with Agranet didn't work all that well. We had some ideas to try to bring some credit. The repayment rate was not great, and so Agranet shut that down. The commission agents were relatively active on the platform, but they were just active as traders. They were just selling. They were not really like brokering aggregated deals for other people. So they really just looked like traders in the rest of the market. So what we ended up doing was hiring 8 full-time staff who went out and ran the promotion and the hand-holding and the training, et cetera, to try to do the ground level village piece of this, and to make sure that they were checking up on deals. And so that kind of more direct hands-on approach ended up being necessary. As I'll talk about at the end, all of our ideas to try to build commissions for the private sector intermediary into the midst of these trades turned out to be quite hard to execute. These trades move very fast. The whole point of the platform is that things are quick and inexpensive, and therefore, to try to build any kind of serious commission system into that turned out to be a heavy lift. So that leaves us with some ideas about what might contribute to sustainability moving forward. The overall study design, basically, we began by selecting sub-counties. Within those sub-counties, we identified all 236 trading centers, which were basically permanent markets, not like day of the week wet markets, but permanent trading markets in which traders had stores. Those trading centers became the primary sampling units for everything. So then we did our market surveys there, we surveyed the traders in those markets, and we based the farmer sampling around those. And then we allocated 55 sub-counties to treatment, 55 to control. One thing that you're going to see throughout our results is, despite the fact that this is a massive study, it's really on the edge of being underpowered. And the reason it is that it only has 110 experimental units, right? So when you correctly account for that, we actually don't have a very large study in a statistical sense, even though its physical scope is very large. And then down below, we have this randomization of farmers into receiving and not receiving the SMS blast. The study went for 3 full years, which, as I said, was 6 seasons. The trader midline was done after the first year, so after 2 seasons, and then the end lines were done after the 6th season. And then we kept running the SMS blast and the market survey system a little bit longer. The reason being that at the very end of the study, after we'd done our end lines, we tried rolling a bunch of control markets into the SMS blast as just kind of one other way of seeing what happens if you do only price information. How much do you change market outcomes as a result of doing that? Okay, so some basic stats on usage. So we had about 24,000 unique asks posted onto the system. 45% of those came from study traders, 14% from CAs. And then only 6% of those came from study farmers at all, despite the fact that we were blasting them with information about Kudu. So as we said before, we really were not very successful in getting broad scale usage of the platform by farmers. On the bids side, 48% of the bids come from study traders, 11% from CAs, and then of course, farmers were very unlikely to be buyers on the system. The total transaction on the system was 7,300 tons of grain, worth about $2.3 million, which is, at one level, a lot of money. At another level, it's a tiny fraction, obviously, of the total volume of trade. Maize accounted for the majority of this. 80% of treated traders is in the, so in other words, the study traders in the treatment area, 80% of them posted onto Kudu at least once, and 22% of them were successful in actually completing a deal on kudu. Among the study farmers, 26% attempted to post and only 2% of treated households successfully traded on the exchange. So, right, that's an indication that only 1 out of 13 of the people who tried to sell were successful. It's a way of saying this thing that study farmers were trying to sell in the end was not actually a very attractive commodity, and that therefore they had a hard time really doing business on the platform, okay? So then, looking at impact, so what we're representing here then is in the control dyad, so where both markets in a dyad are untreated, what we're showing here is the probability that there's any trade, the number of traders moving between them, the trade volume moving between them, and the price dispersion between them. Okay, so this is kind of the counterfactual state. And then we can add on top of this the relevant curves for dyads where one market is treated and dyads where both market is treated. So what do you see? You see that there's virtually no trade by our study traders above 200 kilometers at all. That doesn't mean that grain is not moving 200 kilometers. First of all, it may be that you have chain trades where a trader sells to a trader sells to a trader. And so the grain is moving over much longer distances than any specific individual moves it. It may also be the case that because we drew our sample of traders from people who were actually working in small rural markets, that the people who are moving grain long distances live in big cities, and so they weren't drawn into our sample. So it may be that specific single traders are in fact going these 500 kilometer distances from one side of the country to the other, but if so, it's not our traders, okay? So then in terms of the impacts on trading and volume of trade kind of scale proportionately with the distances over which our traders actually work. So, you know, we have, for example, if you look in the lower left at the trade volume, more than double trade volume among very close nearby markets. And then that dies off fairly quickly, that once you get to 200, nobody was trading anyway. So at some level, what we're seeing here is kind of the opposite of this story that you connect up the remote rural farmer with the big urban buyer. We don't see that at all. What we see instead is rural traders moving to nearby markets with much higher frequency. Now, interestingly, when you look at the price dispersion graph, you see treatment effects over a much larger range of distances. So in a sense, the price dispersion is like the reduced form effect of how much grain actually moved from one market to another, regardless of who traded it, right? So all the other pictures are about the behavior of a specific trader, whereas the final picture is really about the total net flow of grain. And we see convergence over much longer distances, which is consistent with this idea that you have this kind of chain of trading. And so, you know, 3 different traders all having treatment effects at 100 kilometers can now create a treatment effect at 300 kilometers, okay? The other thing that you're seeing from this picture that I think is very important to point out is that in every case, the treatment effect of having one market in the dyad treated, which you could think of as a form of spillover effect, right? Because this is something showing up in a control market that is coming from linkage to a treatment market. In every case, those spillover effects are moving in the same direction as the treatment effect. So at some level, that's surprising, right? Because in a normal model of trade, you know, if a country produces so much of an output, and it starts to trade more of that with one country, it has to trade less with another. So that's the concept of trade diversion, right? So in international trade, trade diversion is the norm. Anywhere that you see trade increasing, it's generally, at least in the short term, going to be compensated for by a decrease in trade somewhere else. So we're not seeing trade diversion here. That may be consistent with the idea that a lot of grain is consumed by the households that produce it, right? So only a small share of grain is marketed in the first place. And so when farmers face better prices, they may increase the total amount that they sell, even in the short term. And because they're increasing the total amount that they sell, you can get trade increases to treated markets and not have that arise strictly from diversion from control markets, okay? So then thinking about, well, wait, what does this do to our measurement? If we have spillover effects in control villages, in control sub-counties, this indicates that those spillover effects are going in the same direction as the treatment effects. And that would imply that overall we're underestimating the effect of this intervention because we're comparing to a control group that has been kind of pushed in the direction of the treatment, okay? So then the net result on this price dispersion is this is what the control dyads look like. This is what the treatment dyads look like. And so if you kind of toggle back and forth between these, this is the treatment effect of the platform on price dispersion. As I said earlier, overall, this indicates that we've squeezed out about 20% of the price dispersion that comes from a violation of the law of one price, which is sort of what we could have hoped to achieve from this intervention, okay? So in some sense, a fairly impressive treatment effect, in some sense, an indication that there's still a lot of work left to do in terms of generating even search-based convergence, let alone what would come from building roads, okay? So then let me go kind of fairly quickly through a lot of the tables. So then if we look at the overall impact on trade flows, they're small because most of these are dyads that are over long distances. If we then split by above and below 200 kilometers, we're then seeing, significant effects on trade, traders, volume, and price dispersion showing up within 200 kilometers and not above that, as we said earlier. When we look at Kudu, when we look at Kudu, the picture is even more pronounced. One thing that I want to talk about, I think is quite interesting. So we have two different ways of thinking about what's the effect of information only. So one of those is, as I said, that we treated 3/4 of farming households with the SMS blast and the other quarter not. And the other thing that we have is that we rolled this set of control markets into receiving the SMS blast. So basically, the long and the short of both of those experiments is that there's just no evidence whatsoever that only sending price information is leading to these same convergence effects that the platform as a whole is. And so in that sense, our study is kind of consonant with this broader literature that seems to indicate that if you want to move the needle on prices, you're going to have to do something deeper than just sending out price information. That's not generally going to be enough, especially in environments where people are well informed to begin with. So I've already talked about some of this. I mean, we were very cognizant of spillovers going into the study. In any study where your goal is to push market prices, it's pretty obvious you're thinking about spillovers from the very beginning. So that was the reason to step up and use this big pixel size to randomize at the sub-county level. So there's kind of two things that we think we might achieve with that. One of them is that it's going to minimize the direct information spillovers, okay? And those are not tiny, right? So if we look at this, these are, so if we look at this, we're seeing, for example, down here that 2% of control farmers actually tried to use Kudu, and 16% of treatment farmers tried to use Kudu, right? So yes, the wedge is very large, but there is appreciable use of the platform in control communities. So not only is there something going on where directly the interventions are spilling over, but then there's also going to be market price spillovers as well that are going to occur, okay? So the two channels, one of them we've already talked about, is this issue of trade diversion, and it really looks like we're not seeing that go on. Another mechanism that you might worry about would be that if you are successful in driving a price wedge between two adjacent sub-counties, even a trader who knows nothing about the intervention but is relatively well informed is going to see that that wedge has come to exist and is now going to start to try trading on that wedge. And as they trade on that wedge, they're going to have a tendency to pull it back together again. So at some level, we can think of this as like spillovers in quantities or spillovers in prices. Either of these things could occur. It looks like they did occur in the sense that we're seeing this one treated effect. And the one treated effect that we're seeing is kind of more consistent with this price spillover mechanism than it is with the quantity spillover mechanism. So what we're working on now is like a GE mechanism that would, a structural model that is going to basically take the baseline network of trade seriously, try to think about how the spillover effect should be propagating through those trade networks, and then using that structural model, try to back out treatment effects that can then be corrected for these general equilibrium effects. You can kind of structurally subtract the spillovers out and try to get at the overall effect of the treatment, okay? So the takeaway at some level is everything we're showing you here we think is slightly underestimated. Now, another way of framing the convergence result is that we see price increases in areas that were previously surplus areas, and price decreases in areas that were previously deficit areas. So in this panel on the left, the dotted line is the control group price gradient across the extent of market and surplus in a sub-county. And what we're seeing is that there's a very steep line. So areas that have big surpluses have lower prices. And what the intervention does is flatten that line out, meaning that if you look at the treatment effect, we have an insignificant decrease in price in deficit areas and a significant increase in price in surplus areas. So that's another way of thinking about this convergence result. So this is just showing that. Now, again, I want to make the point, convergence has welfare benefits, right? So there's a kind of a canonical Econ 101 model thinking about what happens as you move from autarky into fully arbitrage trade. And that basically says that in the deficit areas that you're going to get an increase in producer surplus. In the surplus areas, you're going to get an increase in consumer surplus, and that those outweigh the cost of the other side of the market, leading to an aggregate increase in welfare. We're obviously not going from autarky to perfect, but we're going from a sort of imperfect to less imperfect. And so we think that there's real welfare benefits to be generated from these convergence effects. And that's kind of another purpose to which we want to put a structural model. So then let me just go very quickly through the micro evidence. So who gains, who loses, what were the mechanisms for how this worked? So I already showed you this. What we're seeing is that, there's a big change in the way that people report the information they have. So, the fraction of traders who say that farmers know what's going on, the fraction of traders who are telling you that farmer information changed the negotiations has gone up. The fraction of farmers who say that they're using SMS price information as a part of their negotiation has changed. So in general, we're seeing better price information and some use of price information in treatment areas. When we look at the trader impacts, what we see is a pretty meaningful decrease in profits, right? So from about 7 million shillings, it falls by about 1,000. So, a decrease of about 15% in trader profits. That's coming despite an increase in volumes. So what's happening is they're trading bigger volumes at lower margins, and their overall revenue is falling as a result. We're also seeing a homogenization of trader profits. So in the control group, trader profits are quite heterogeneous, which is consistent with the idea that it takes a lot of skill to trade in low information environments. Part of what the platform does is it kind of automates trading a little bit. It makes it a little bit more obvious what prices you should be buying and selling for. And so as a result, we see this decrease in the heterogeneity of markups for traders. So that's yet a different form of convergence, that the traders are becoming more similar to each other as a result of the intervention. On the farmer side, we see, changes in revenues and changes in prices that are reasonably large from an economic point of view, but are pretty far from significant statistically, right? So this is kind of the core place where we feel like we're looking at an overall result that may be a bit underpowered. If you break that down, we are seeing significant increases in farmer revenues in surplus areas, which is what you would expect. That's where the prices should have gone up the most. And we're also seeing significant increases in revenues and quantities for farmers who have a high propensity to use kudu. So we go through and basically estimate a propensity score in the treatment group, apply that to both groups interacting with the treatment. And what that says is that the kinds of farmers who use the platform are seeing improvements in profits as a result, okay? So then to kind of summarize and step back a little bit. So contrary to common motivation, this platform is actually not used by most farmers. in line with what we would have thought, it has a detrimental effect on trader profit, but it's not coming from the fact that trader market power erodes in any given trade. It's coming from the fact that the overall gaps that traders have to trade off of across space have decreased in general equilibrium. So it's like a GE hit on the traders, not this partial equilibrium effect coming from bargaining power. Nonetheless, there are still overall gains for farmers, particularly in surplus areas. There's biggest gains for the farmers who are the largest and are most likely to use the platform. So the really strong determinants of using the platform are being male and having a large marketed surplus. So those are the heavy users, and those are the ones who benefit the most. And then noisy, smaller, but still potentially sizable gains to indirectly affected farmers. And what I'll show in a second is that because that number of indirectly affected farmers is massive, it ends up kind of driving our simple welfare calculations. So then what we can do here is I can give you a very simple kind of back of the envelope calculation. And then what we're engaged in now is trying to use a structural model to do a more rigorous job of establishing what those welfare impacts are. Just to talk through the back of the envelope, to run the intervention for 3 years cost about $900,000, not including any study costs. Okay, so those are just operating costs. That's all the funders that I thanked at the beginning of the talk. If we take the profit effect per trader, and then we look at the fact that we have, this 1457 traders in the sample who represent this population, then we can apply the profit effect to the population of traders. And that indicates that we've destroyed $1.5 million worth of trader profits over the course of the time that we ran this study. And so if you add those two costs together, those are net costs of almost $2.5 million. If you then go to the farmer side, here are, again, we're talking about some of these numbers are statistically insignificant, right? So I'm making a lot of hay out of numbers that are not significant. But if you take these numbers at face value, here you have the revenue effect per year, the number of years they were experienced. These are the study sample numbers, but these are the population numbers that those are sampled to be representative of. And so what's going on here is that these individuals who live in distant villages and did not get the blast represent almost 1 million households. And so when we scale those up, those households are completely dominant in terms of generating the total welfare effects. We're seeing $34 million worth of benefits just in that stratum alone. And so then the net calculation overall is that this somewhat heroic extrapolation out to the population that we sampled to be representative of is indicating over $30 million in total net benefits from the platform. All of that coming from really very small benefits per person, right? So again, not large benefits for any individual, but those benefits spread over huge numbers of individuals. So just to wrap up then, we're basically seeing improvement in arbitrage by reducing search and matching frictions. This is being driven almost entirely via price convergence. That price convergence lower traders' profits, and it helps farmers, particularly in surplus areas. So this is kind of the expected impact, but not through the expected channels. Now, what this kind of indicates in the big picture, so something I didn't talk too much about is that there were huge price shocks that rolled through these markets over the course of time. So one thing that I would like to kind of highlight is that basically time series is a really dominant risk in these markets. If you just put in fixed effects for the rounds of the market survey, they soak up 83% of the variation. So 83% of all price fluctuation in our study is pure time series. Everybody says, you give me price information that's 2 weeks old, I don't care about it at all. I need completely up-to-date price information. The way these markets trade, the grain is like a hot potato that everyone's trying to hand off as fast as they can, because the longer they hold it, the more risk they expose themselves to. So I think we went into this study thinking that trader market power was a big deal and price risk was not a very big deal. And I think, at least personally, I come out of the study with the opposite sense. Search-based trader market power, I think, may be a less important feature than we focused on. And the degree of price risk, even in markets that appear to be spot markets, right? We're not talking about storage. We're not talking about warehouse receipts. These look like spot markets. And yet the reason that it is so hard to bulk and aggregate as you move up the supply chain is exactly that nobody wants to hold on to the grain for very long because it exposes them to so much risk. So I think that's kind of bringing in this stylized fact that maybe things along the lines of forward prices and futures markets coming down from the top may be underappreciated features of making even spot markets work better, and that some of these ideas that were very, very prominent in the 80s and 90s around trying to bring in commodities markets, not for spot markets, but in order to enable the creation of futures prices, this is maybe something that we want to be re-examining, okay? So then next steps, structural model, trying to think about GE effects of trade, trying to think about how much of the effects to traders is getting passed through to farmers, and then trying to be able to back out what's the total treatment effect of the platform once we've incorporated the spillover effects that were experienced in the control. So just a last epilogue. Basically, neither Kudu nor Agronet managed to make money out of our study. So we really worked hard to find ways of allowing them to come in and pull commissions out of the middle of those trades. And we were basically never successful in doing that. It may be that we need to set up some kind of mobile money interface to allow that to happen, but that seems to be a very complicated thing to build. We worked at it for 3 years and we weren't successful at it. So as of now, our takeaway is that the two most obvious models to make this kind of platform work are going to be fee-based. And there are effectively two fee-based models one could think about. One of them is fee-based information to trade on Kudu. And our estimates are that you need to charge about $1 per bid or ask to make the system sustainable. That's a pretty high price for smallholders to pay, and it may further diminish use. And the other possibility would be to use it as a mechanism to sell a price information subscription, where you're using the fact that the platform generates real-time credible data on prices by location, and that you're then blasting that information out, and that's the subscription that you're selling. So, kind of the takeaway, which is the same thing we're seeing from a lot of the RCTs on these kinds of market systems, is the fundamental logic seems to be there. RCTs are not a very good environment in which to build sustainable market platforms. And so at some level, what we want to see happen now is that these things move out into the natural world and get built at scale by commercial actors. Okay, so I'll stop there, and thanks for listening to the talk.
Thanks, Craig. We actually don't have many questions that came up during the talk, so you are either very clear and answered people's questions as you presented, or you confused people to the point that they couldn't even think of what to ask. So, but actually what we're going to do is move into the Q&A session now. And if you'd like to provide a verbal question, please raise your hand on Zoom using the button again at the bottom of the toolbar, and we can unmute you one at a time. And as always, you're still invited to type your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. We did have a question from David Solomon, who's from South Sudan, and he was wondering, well, he says, as you know, mobile phone usage is limited here among the rural population, and even the phones used are only flip phones. So could you use this type of model in South Sudan? And I had kind of a related question, here at the foundation, when we're talking about our, sort of digital investments, one big concern is, the digital divide. Can you speak to how, if at all, the digital divide influenced the use of the trading platform for both, small and large scale farmers? So those two kind of questions together, was there kind of a digital divide issue? And would something like this even be feasible in a country like South Sudan?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So I think, the simple answer is yes, it's feasible in the sense that this platform was completely accessible from a flip phone. So the first time you use the platform, usually you would end up talking to someone on the phone. And part of that conversation is to say, okay, where are you located? Which district, which sub-county? And so then your telephone number is being registered in the system with a location. There's a location information is very hard to deal with on a flip phone. So once the system knows, if I'm getting a message from this phone, this is where this person is, Then now all you have to do is open up a USSD session on the flip phone, which, as you know, is the way that like the mobile money, the airtime systems work, et cetera. So people are quite familiar with how to use USSD. And that then lets them put in the information about how much they want to sell, what the commodity is, what the reserve price is, et cetera. So in a way, the simple answer to your question is like, there's no point even starting with a platform that is farmer facing in sub-Saharan Africa unless it works on flip phones. And yes, this platform works just fine on flip phones. And I think it's a good application for them in the sense that it's the kind of consequential, simple interaction that is quite doable on USSD. As you know, you only have 90 seconds. So you can't generate too complicated a string of information exchanges on USSD or it'll time out and it's very frustrating to use. I think the more difficult answer is the digital divide question about who will really use it and who will really benefit from it. So I think our results are kind of glass half full and glass half empty in that regard. The glass is half empty in the sense that very clearly this platform was regressive in its use by farmers. It was big farmers with large marketed surpluses. It was males, right? So these are the farmers who are already the most market exposed and in some sense already look the most like traders themselves who were using the platform. So in that sense, the glass is half empty, and this looks quite regressive. We didn't succeed very well in reaching out to those very poor rural smallholder farmers. But the way the glass is half full is that, in fact, it really doesn't look like the benefits that we generated from farmers come from farmers actually using the platform. The benefits are coming from the fact that their markets are getting better integrated as a whole because the traders around them are using the platform. And that is the feature that generates the farmer welfare. So that's kind of one of the other things that we're trying to do with the structural model is to get at this issue of, do you actually need farmers to use these platforms at all? If these are going to be the ways the benefits are generated, then it really does suggest it's about integrating the markets. That's why farmers benefit. And you can sort of trace out almost all of what's going to happen to farmers from what's happening to the market prices around them, whether they're using the platforms or not. So that might indicate that this intervention is one where so much of the impact comes from general equilibrium effects that it actually doesn't turn out to be all that important who specifically uses it and who doesn't.
Thanks. So another question came in from I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Yifan Powers, and wants to know, like, could you describe in a little bit more detail the role that these 8 full-time staff that you mentioned were based in Kampala played? Specifically, like, what did they do on the trader side and the farmer side to get a trade to happen, and how long did that take?
Yeah, so the algorithm, as I said, was basically clearing every 24 hours and doing these automated matches. And not only was the total number of automated matches relatively low, but the success rate, in other words, given that you have a match, what's the probability that that translates into successful trade, was quite low. And so as time passed, we ended up investing more and more in this manual matching process. And the manual matching process was, like I said, it was basically people sitting there with a screen open in front of them that had the bid and ask data set sorted by location every morning. And so then they were looking at the new bids and the new asks that had come up onto the platform, and they're trying to find people who are within reasonable distances of each other. We found all through the study that it was very hard to broker trade across really long distances. It just wasn't successful, even though the price wedges may have been, reasonable. There's just so many issues of transport cost and trust and risk that come up that it was much easier to broker trades over shorter distances, as you saw. And so then what they would do is really, like I said, kind of work the phones, that they're basically now calling the buyer and saying, okay, I think I have a seller for you. It's such and such. Are you interested? Yes, I'm interested. Okay, then call the seller. I think I have a buyer for you. So going back and forth, the advantages of this were, first of all, they got to know people over the course of time because we had a lot of repeat business from the same people. So they got to build up trust with the people they were working with. They got to know who was serious, like this person has done, 23 trades. I think they're going to do another one if I call them. And then it also allowed them to kind of throw things back into the pool in quite a quick and sensitive way. So it was an issue that we had throughout the algorithmic trading process is what is the rule that we want to use where we've decided that a machine match isn't going to work, and therefore we put the buyer and the seller back into the pool again. That's actually not a very simple algorithmic process to solve because you don't want to make it too quick, you don't want to make it too slow. And so one of the big advantages of the of this manual matching is that they could get a good buyer and then basically just run straight through a whole lot of sellers until they found someone who got the buyer what they wanted. And then that looked like customer service. And it also let them deal with kind of replacement of failed matches in a very quick and sensitive way. And so it led to a much higher success rate for the sellers and consequently, for the buyers, and consequently the buyers were happier with the system. And so everything worked better. So, you know, on the one hand, it's like kind of sexy to describe the algorithm, and it appears to be very attractive to have this whole thing happening in this scaled automated way. And of course, it is more scalable to have it all done automatically. But I think that, you know, one thing that we found from this project is that if you really want, you know, these matches to translate into trade, there's a lot of information that has to be incorporated. It's not so easy to do, and having human beings involved, both in engaging in the matching and in engaging in calling people up and talking through their concerns, is a very effective way of getting business to be done.
Thanks. Yeah, and staying on sort of the theme of matches, Jess Rudder asks, like, were there, you know, heterogeneous treatment effects based on whether a transaction was between new trading partners versus old partners? Do you have any information around that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't looked specifically at that. I mean, the probability that any two individuals actually match again in the system is quite low. We do, of course, ask questions about when you did business on Kudu, did you ever then take that business offline and continue to trade? And we do have evidence from the surveys that that happened, that in other words, a seller found a buyer using Kudu once, and that then the next season they called the same person back. So now that trade is not going to move through Kudu, but it was in some sense caused by Kudu. It's again kind of another problem with trying to recover money as commissions, is that if you start charging high commissions, there's really nothing stopping people from just moving out and doing the deal diatically without you in the middle of it, right? So there is definitely some hysteresis here, and there is definitely a sense in which individuals who have matched once are more prone to do trade again. We don't see a high enough rate of literally the same two individuals getting matched in Kudu for us to do very much with that. But I think the general question is a very interesting one, and the underlying idea that there is like relational capital in trading, and that part of the problem with these anonymous systems is that they're trying to connect people who don't have that relational capital. And so explicitly recognizing that as a problem and trying to see how you can overcome it and build on it is very important. We did try experimenting with a set of transaction guarantees. So we were interested in trying to see, you know, is this contractual risk piece really something that's inhibiting trade, especially from the buyer's side, right? So, you know, the idea that I would get to the village and they've already sold what they were going to sell, or that they don't have as much as they told me, or the quality's not as good. So we tried experimenting with a set of randomized transaction guarantees to see if we could kind of kickstart some trade with that at the beginning of the study. And the results from that were not very encouraging. So traders who get those transaction guarantees are not doing more business. We found that people were kind of gaming the system, that once they realized that they could come back in until they got that guarantee, there was a bit of gaming to try to get it. But overall, it didn't have an effect of enhancing the total amount of trade. So that's not to say that there isn't a ton of risk in trading, and it's not to say that the kind of relationship question that you're asking about isn't really important. Is to say that like that contractual mechanism to try to address the problem didn't seem to be effective.
Thanks. So Alan Nyakana from Uganda, and I think you touched on this very briefly, Craig, during your talk, but his question is like, did the study consider the effects of like fluctuations in grain quantity or in quantity of production over the seasons, like due to say, variation in weather? And do you think that had any impact on the findings of the study?
Yeah, so as you'll know from Uganda, there was a huge price spike that occurred in the middle of the study in 2017. So prices halfway through the study were twice as high as they were at the beginning or the end of the study. So we kind of rode this huge wave up and then back down again over the course of the study. So there was a massive amount of overall price fluctuation, but the very large majority of that price spike was experienced everywhere in Uganda. So it wasn't like it was just one region and not another. So we have spent some time trying to look at the question that you're raising. I think it's a very good question. It's a natural one to ask, which is like, if we're saying that what the system does is to generate price convergence, part of the story should be that in this season, prices were good here and prices were bad there, and it brought them together. We've actually had quite a hard time seeing that in the data. So most of the convergence effect that we're getting are between areas that were always grain surplus and areas that were always grain deficit. So that's kind of more of a cross-sectional version of the story. You're asking about this variation that comes in one season in one place and another season in another place. And we actually haven't seen a huge convergence effect coming from that in the data. So I would have expected that would have been an important part of the story. And from what you're seeing so far, it doesn't seem to be the case that was really most of what was happening. Most of what was happening was really about this organizing the movement of grain from places that reliably have surplus to places that reliably have deficit.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Olin Wanda to unmute themselves. They had a question about maybe what government's role could be in this.
Thank you, Prof. Prof. McIntosh and Richard for this presentation. It's a very good one, exciting one. I'm Olin Wanda from Uganda, from National Planning Authority, and this is a very good policy study for us to guide us. My question is, before the question, I was especially happy with your statement, and to have integrated markets, you need a lot of investments in physical infrastructure, but you also noted that investments in ICT can alternatively help, and that is a very big knowledge for Uganda, that investments in ICT can cut that big cost on infrastructure. And we have rolled out our new National Development Plan, which is the National Development Plan 3. And we have a program on digital transformation, and to scale it into agriculture, and specifically agricultural marketing, is very important. So specifically, what can government do to encourage farmers to use the platform? While the benefits from traders using it can be realized, but specifically for the farmers to use the platform, because you noted that even accessing information, only 6% from the radio, and then the use on the Kudu platform was very low. So what can government do? And the related question is, what could have been the reason for all use of the platform by the farmers? Would it be a result of education, or low education levels, or factors like that? And then lastly, you touched on it, but maybe for purposes of emphasis, how can government support platforms like Kudu to scale up and be used? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are all great questions. So I think if I try to just speak from our results, that maybe the angle that I would take is that it is possible to emphasize too much the fact that a farmer should him or herself be using this platform, right? So you kind of pointed to that in the way you asked the question, that if a farmer is selling a half a ton of maize or a ton of maize, it really doesn't matter what linkages you make to buyers. Like, no buyer is going to offer a good price and send a vehicle from a place where high prices are being paid to purchase such a small amount of maize. And so at the end of the day, the person in rural areas who is able to engage with the people who pay high prices is the person who is aggregating. And if we believe that that person has a lot of market power, we fear that person and we try to empower the farmer over that person. If you take our results at face value, it suggests that maybe that person who's aggregating actually doesn't have that much market power and is providing a service that is a very important and necessary service. And as you said, it's much easier to get that person to use the platform than it is to go all the way out into the village and get very small farmers to try to use it. So I think if I were trying to build this at scale, so the first thing I would say is it is scale that matters. You want mass usership, because this is like all of these digital markets, that if it's a small market, it doesn't work well for anybody, and it works better for everyone as it gets bigger. So it's a natural monopoly. You want it as large as possible. And so I think the first thing I would say is just scale, 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 scale. And the obvious tool to generate mass scale in rural Africa is the radio. So in RCTs, we often don't use the radio because we don't want to pollute our control group. I think like that is the thing that would be very obvious to do, is to go out and do a mass marketing campaign where you're trying to get huge numbers of people enrolled in the same season at the same time. So you've got very large volumes on there. And I think that focusing on that first makes a lot more sense than going out on the ground and trying to build it up from smallholder farmers first. There's going to be a much more expensive proposition. Now, with a scaled platform in place that is being heavily used by traders, now you have an interesting question to ask, which is to say, what can you gain now by additionally hooking farmers up to that platform, right? So with an operating scaled trading platform, the question of farmer access becomes a really interesting one. And in a way, it becomes a pretty easy one to study, right? If the platform's there, you can access it from a mobile phone. Now you can just send out teams and they can do sensitization and training, and you can have extension agents who know how to use this, and they go around at harvest time and they help farmers put their crops up on the platform. In some sense, once the platform is working, it's not so hard to do the research to figure out what can we do to integrate farmers into it and what's the benefit of integrating them into it. Ultimately, the hard thing from the perspective of national development is building a scaled platform. I think the results of our study show that that is beneficial to do. I think it also shows that it's hard to do. Getting public investment, getting scale, getting a deep market, that's what's necessary to really get this initiative up and running. And so my advice would be focus on that piece first. It's going to be traders who build that market. And with that market in place, now we have a straightforward, in a sense, relatively simple question about how do we actually connect farmers up to that scaled operating market. I hope that makes sense given your knowledge of the system.
Thanks, Craig. I think I'm going to take the last question. And what role did storage play, or what role could storage play? And was there any aggregation that ever occurred before the trader actually got the commodity? And I'm thinking maybe like farmer producer organizations or farm level organizations.
Yeah, so we worked hard to achieve that. And we actually had a phase of the project that we called e-bulking, where we were trying to say, okay, we can see on the platform from the asks that we have, 15 farmers all within 10 kilometers of each other, each trying to sell 1 ton. And nobody wants to buy that 1 ton, but somebody might want to buy 15 tons. And so can we use the information that the platform has to achieve a form of bulking that then allows those farmers to aggregate themselves together and sell something which is more attractive and is more likely to lead to a high price sale? And we found that very, very difficult to do. And so, again, I want to come back to this role of price risk that, first of all, when the farmers are ready to sell, that's the hungriest of the hungry seasons for them, right? So they really need cash there and then. So farmers need to sell because they haven't sold anything for months and they need the money at that moment in time. But the traders are also very uncomfortable to buy and hold grain longer than they need to. And so achieving bulking without providing some sort of credit or risk protection turned out to be something that was quite difficult for us to achieve as a part of the study. And so that's why I'm saying that, we think of, a kilo of maize as a kilo of maize as a kilo of maize. But I think that one insight that we take away from the study is that the kilo of maize sitting in the sort of dirty bag out in the village that's only 50 kilo bag versus a kilo of maize sitting in an aggregated truck of 40 tons, those are really two different products, and the willingness to pay for those two products is quite different. And the traders are engaging in a service as they move up that supply chain. So we see in our price data very clearly what others have found in many other contexts is that on average, there is this substantial price increase that takes place over the course of the harvest season. So indeed, everyone is, selling low and buying high. There is, about a 30 to 40% price increase over the course from the sales season into the hungry season. But because we're there for years, we also see what happens multiple seasons. So, in 1 out of those 6 seasons, someone would have lost a little bit of money. In 1 out of the 6 seasons, someone would have lost an enormous amount of money by buying and holding grain over that period of time. So I think that what has been linked up for me that I didn't see before this study is we refer to the kind of trading that we have in this study as spot market trading, as if it has no temporal dimension. But that many of the things that we want to see happen in order for value to be added, quality grading, drying, aggregating, bulking, all of these things take time. And that a side effect of that time is that somebody has to sit on that grain and incur an enormous amount of risk because the prices fluctuate with such high frequency. So I feel, as I said before, that there's a linkage between a set of questions that we knew were important in storage and tended to think were not important in spot markets. I'm now quite motivated by the fact that actually those issues are also there in spot markets, and bulking is in a sense a short-term form of storage. Bulking is incredibly important, and I think it's being inhibited by price risk.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Craig, I want to thank you very much for the presentation. I know this is a study that's garnering quite a bit of attention. In true academic fashion, it raises more questions than it answers, so that's a good thing maybe. But really appreciate your time and effort, and also appreciate the participation of everyone who joined us. Jenna, did you have anything to add? Are we good?
I do. Thank you both so much, Professor McIntosh and Richard. And thank you to everyone here who joined this session and asked insightful questions about the results of the study and also its policy implications. Whether you found this session through the Center for Effective Global Action Outreach via the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, AgriLinks, or one of our partners, we encourage you to stay in touch, and we'll paste the link in the chat where you can subscribe to our newsletters to be informed about future webinar events, and where we'll also share when new studies are available. You can also learn more at the ATAI website, which is atai-research.org. Thank you all. I hope that you have a great day or evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, everyone.